In a high-end restaurant in Manhattan, a billionaire laughed when her nephew suggested asking their waiter for financial advice on a $12 billion merger. It was just a harmless joke, the kind wealthy people make at the expense of those who serve them. But when the waiter looked up and spoke his first words, the smile on Victoria Hale's face vanished completely. No one at that table could understand how a single father living on tips could see straight through a deal that her highest-paid advisors had missed. Who was this man, and what was he hiding? The Summit was the kind of restaurant where a single bottle of wine cost more than Daniel Reed made in a week. Crystal chandeliers hung from ceilings that seemed to stretch toward heaven, and the soft clink of silverware against porcelain plates created a rhythm that only money could compose. Daniel moved through the dining room like a ghost, refilling water glasses, clearing plates, and vanishing before anyone could remember his face. He had worked here for 3 years, and in all that time, not a single guest had ever asked his name. That was exactly how he wanted it. His phone buzzed in his pocket, a text from the babysitter. Lily had a slight fever, but she was sleeping now and seemed okay. Daniel felt his chest tighten. The medicine she needed would cost $40, and he had exactly $53 in his account until payday. He did the math quickly in his head. Rent was due in 6 days, and he still owed the landlord from last month. He slipped the phone back into his pocket and picked up another tray. Around him, men in tailored suits laughed about quarterly earnings and stock options worth more than his apartment building. At table 12, a group of executives discussed a merger that would net them 8 figures each. One of them complained that his bonus this year was disappointing, only $2 million instead of $3 million. Daniel set down their appetizers without a word, his face perfectly neutral. He had learned long ago to make himself invisible. In his old life, he had sat at tables like this one. He had been the one laughing, the one complaining about bonuses, but that life belonged to someone else now, a man named Daniel Reed, who had died 5 years ago, along with everything he had ever built. The front doors opened, and the energy in the restaurant shifted. Daniel looked up to see a woman in her late 50s walking in, flanked by a small army of assistants and advisors. She wore a black dress that probably cost more than a car, and her silver hair was pulled back in a way that made her look both elegant and severe. Victoria Hale. Daniel recognized her immediately. Everyone in the financial world knew her face. She had built Hale Industries from nothing, turning a small investment firm into a multi-billion-dollar empire through sheer will and ruthless intelligence. The tabloids called her the Ice Queen of Wall Street. Looking at her now, Daniel understood why. Behind her walked a younger man in his late 20s, his jaw set with the kind of arrogance that came from inheriting power rather than earning it. Ryan Hale, Victoria's nephew, and the newly appointed vice president of Hale Industries. Daniel had read about him in passing, a Harvard MBA who had never worked a day outside his aunt's company. The rest of the entourage consisted of financial advisors in expensive suits and lawyers carrying leather briefcases. They were shown to the private dining area in the back, the one reserved for guests who didn't want to be seen, or who wanted everyone to know they were too important to sit with ordinary people. Daniel was assigned to serve their table. He approached with menus and water, keeping his eyes down and his movements efficient. The group was celebrating something. He could tell by the champagne already being ordered and the self-congratulatory tone of their conversation. Victoria sat at the head of the table, listening more than speaking, her sharp eyes taking in everything around her. She controlled the room without saying a word, and Daniel recognized that kind of power. He had seen it before, in boardrooms and conference calls, in the eyes of men who could destroy careers with a single phone call. As he poured water, Fragments of conversation drifted toward him. They were discussing a merger, a big one. $12 billion. A partnership with Meridian Capital that would reshape the financial landscape. Daniel's hand trembled slightly, but he steadied it before anyone could notice. Meridian Capital. The name hit him like a punch to the gut. He had spent 5 years trying to forget that name, trying to bury the memories of what it had cost him. His career, his reputation, his wife. He forced himself to keep pouring, to keep his face blank, to remain invisible. Ryan Hale was on his 3rd glass of champagne when he noticed Daniel standing nearby. The young man's eyes were glazed with alcohol and boredom, and he seemed to be looking for entertainment. He snapped his fingers to get Daniel's attention, a gesture that made several of the advisors shift uncomfortably. Daniel approached the table, his expression neutral. Ryan grinned and leaned back in his chair, clearly enjoying himself. "Hey, waiter, we're about to close a $12 billion deal with Meridian Capital. What do you think? Should we sign?" The table erupted in polite laughter. Even Victoria allowed herself a small smile, though her eyes remained cold. It was nothing more than idle amusement for the rich, a moment of entertainment before the next course arrived. Daniel was supposed to smile awkwardly, mumble something about not knowing anything about finance, and disappear back into the shadows. He turned to leave. But then Ryan kept talking, his voice loud with champagne-fueled confidence. "Marcus Webb himself is flying in tomorrow to finalize everything. The guy's a genius. He structured the whole asset swap, so we get maximum leverage with minimal exposure. 3rd-tier valuation metrics, synthetic equity positions, the whole 9 yards. This is going to be the deal of the century." Daniel stopped walking. Marcus Webb. The name echoed in his skull like a gunshot. And the structure Ryan had just described, 3rd-tier valuation, synthetic equity, asset swaps. Daniel knew that structure. He had seen it before, 5 years ago, in a deal that had destroyed everything he loved. He turned back to the table. The laughter died as the guests noticed the change in his expression. Daniel looked directly at Victoria Hale, and when he spoke, his voice was calm and clear. "The asset swap structure in this deal has a hidden valuation flaw at the 3rd tier, exactly like the Meridian scheme of 2019. If you sign, within 18 months, you'll lose control of 40% of your assets without even knowing it." The silence that followed was absolute. Victoria's smile vanished. The financial advisors exchanged confused glances. These were people paid millions of dollars to analyze deals, and they had no idea what this waiter was talking about. Ryan's face flushed red with anger and embarrassment. Victoria leaned forward, her eyes fixed on Daniel with an intensity that made the air feel thick. Her voice was quiet, but sharp enough to cut glass. "Who are you?" Daniel felt the weight of that question. He could apologize, claim he had misspoken, and walk away. He could go home to Lily, hold her while she slept, and pretend this night had never happened. He could stay invisible, stay safe, stay dead. But then he thought of Sarah, his wife, who had died in a car accident that was never really an accident, who had paid the price for his silence once before. And he thought of all the people who would lose everything if this deal went through. The investors, the employees, the families who would be destroyed by Marcus Webb's greed. Daniel met Victoria's gaze without flinching. The decision had already been made the moment he heard Marcus Webb's name. "Give me 10 minutes, he said. "I'll show you exactly how they're going to steal your empire." The VIP room at the summit had walls thick enough to muffle secrets worth millions. Daniel stood at the head of the table, a cloth napkin spread before him, and a pen borrowed from one of the advisors. Victoria sat at the far end, her arms crossed, watching him with the intensity of a predator studying unfamiliar prey. The financial advisors flanked her on both sides, their expressions ranging from amused contempt to open hostility. Ryan Hale leaned back in his chair, his earlier embarrassment transformed into cold anger. A waiter had turned his joke into something serious, and he clearly intended to make Daniel pay for that humiliation. Daniel began to draw. His hand moved with practiced precision, sketching out the structure of the merger in a series of boxes and arrows. He worked entirely from memory, recreating a deal worth $12 billion on a restaurant napkin. The room was silent, except for the scratch of pen against cloth. Daniel explained as he drew. The shell companies nested within shell companies. The synthetic equity positions designed to obscure true ownership. The third-tier valuation metrics that would slowly transfer control of assets without triggering any regulatory alarms. It was elegant, really, the kind of scheme that only a true genius could design. And Daniel knew exactly who that genius was. When he finished, he looked up to find the advisors exchanging uneasy glances. One of them, a silver-haired man with the confidence of someone who had spent 40 years on Wall Street, cleared his throat dismissively. "This is absurd. You expect us to believe that a waiter understands high-frequency synthetic instruments better than professionals who've spent decades in this industry." Another advisor nodded vigorously. "He probably read some article online and thinks he's an expert. This is a waste of time." Ryan jumped in with obvious satisfaction. "Aunt Victoria, I apologize for this circus. I never should have engaged with the help." Victoria said nothing. Her eyes remained fixed on the napkin, studying the structure Daniel had drawn. Something flickered across her face. Not belief, not yet, but something close to recognition. She had built her empire by trusting her instincts, and right now, those instincts were screaming that this man was not what he appeared to be. But she was also a pragmatist, and the board would never accept financial advice from a waiter over their million-dollar consultants. She looked at Daniel with an expression that was almost apologetic. "Thank you for your input. You may return to your duties." Daniel nodded once and walked out of the VIP room without another word. Behind him, he could hear Ryan's laughter and the advisors congratulating themselves on exposing a fraud. Victoria Hale did not sleep that night. She sat in her penthouse apartment overlooking Central Park, a glass of scotch untouched on the table beside her, staring at the napkin she had taken from the restaurant. The structure Daniel had drawn made a terrible kind of sense. She had built her career on recognizing patterns, on seeing what others missed, and this pattern was too precise to be the invention of an amateur. She picked up her phone and called her head of security, instructing him to run a full background check on Daniel Reed. The results came back 3 hours later. Clean. Too clean. The man had no history before 5 years ago. No college records, no previous employment, no social media presence. It was as if Daniel Reed had been born fully formed at the age of 31. The next morning, Victoria found Daniel at a small coffee shop 3 blocks from his apartment. He was sitting alone at a corner table, nursing a cup of black coffee that had long gone cold. He didn't seem surprised to see her. Victoria slid into the seat across from him, her designer coat looking absurdly out of place in the dingy establishment. She studied him for a long moment before speaking. "Who are you, really?" Daniel met her gaze without flinching. "I'm someone who lost everything because I believed in the system. I don't want you to go through the same thing." Victoria leaned forward, her voice dropping to barely above a whisper. "That's not an answer." Daniel looked out the window at the gray New York morning. "It's the only answer I can give you." Victoria's jaw tightened with frustration. She was not accustomed to being denied information. Then prove what you said last night. Come to my office. Convince my team that you're not just a waiter with delusions of grandeur." Her voice took on an edge of steel. "If you're right, I'll listen to everything you have to say. If you're wrong, you'll lose your job, and you'll never work in any restaurant in this city again. Do we have a deal?" Daniel thought of Lily, of the medicine she needed, of the rent that was already overdue. Then he thought of Marcus Webb, and the thousands of people who would lose everything if this deal went through. "We have a deal," he said. The conference room at Hale Industries occupied the entire 47th floor of a glass tower in Midtown Manhattan. Daniel arrived in his only suit, a cheap gray thing he had bought at a thrift store for job interviews, and found himself facing 5 of the most respected financial analysts on Wall Street. They looked at him the way scientists might look at a specimen under a microscope, with clinical detachment and vague disgust. Victoria sat at the head of the table, her expression unreadable. She gestured to a stack of documents in front of an empty chair. "These are the complete merger documents, 700 pages. Find the flaw you mentioned. You have 30 minutes. Daniel sat down and began to read. The analysts watched with barely concealed smirks, clearly expecting him to be overwhelmed by the complexity of the material. But Daniel's eyes moved across the pages with practiced speed, his fingers marking key sections, his mind assembling the pieces of a puzzle he had seen before. 12 minutes later, he looked up. "I'm done." The room went silent. Victoria raised an eyebrow. "You found the flaw?" Daniel shook his head slowly. "I found 4. He began to explain, pointing to specific clauses and subsections, showing how they interconnected to create a mechanism for gradually transferring control of Hale Industries' core assets to Meridian Capital. The analyst's smirks faded as Daniel spoke. One of them, a younger man with wire-rimmed glasses, went pale as he realized that Daniel was right. The silver-haired analyst from the restaurant, his name was Henderson, stared at Daniel with an expression of dawning recognition. This analysis methodology, the way you deconstruct synthetic positions and trace ownership chains, I've only seen this approach once before. His voice dropped to a whisper. 5 years ago, at Meridian Capital, there was a young director of risk analysis who developed it, but he was... Henderson trailed off, his eyes widening. Victoria turned to Daniel with renewed intensity. "Tell me everything. Now." Daniel looked around the room at the faces staring at him. He had kept this secret for 5 years. He had buried his past to protect his daughter. But the past had found him anyway, and there was no more hiding. Daniel took a breath and began to speak. He told them about his life before, how he had been the director of risk analysis at Meridian Capital, one of the youngest executives ever to hold that position. He told them about discovering the fraud, about the scheme Marcus Webb had been running for years, siphoning billions through a network of shell companies. He told them about trying to report it, about being silenced, about the fabricated evidence of embezzlement that had destroyed his reputation overnight. And then he told them about Sarah, his wife. The car accident that had happened just 2 weeks after he announced his intention to go to the authorities. The brake lines that had mysteriously failed. The investigation that had been closed almost before it began. Victoria watched him speak, and for the first time, her cold expression softened into something like compassion. Daniel's voice was steady as he finished his story. "I could accept losing my career. I could accept losing my reputation. But I couldn't let Lily lose her father the way she lost her mother. So I disappeared. I erased every digital trace of my existence, moved across the country, and became invisible. I've spent 5 years hiding in plain sight, working as a waiter, raising my daughter, and trying to forget that Marcus Webb exists." He looked directly at Victoria, but when I heard his name last night, when I saw that he was about to do to you what he did to me, I couldn't stay silent. Not again." The room was absolutely still. Victoria saw Daniel clearly for the first time. Not as a waiter, not as a financial genius, but as a father who had sacrificed everything to protect his child. The door to the conference room opened without warning. Marcus Webb walked in, flanked by 2 assistants carrying leather briefcases. He was tall and impeccably dressed, with silver-streaked hair, and the kind of easy confidence that came from decades of getting exactly what he wanted. His smile was warm and practiced as he extended his hand toward Victoria. "Victoria, wonderful to see you. I thought I'd stop by early to go over some final details before—" He stopped mid-sentence. His eyes had found Daniel. For a fraction of a second, genuine shock broke through Marcus's polished facade. Then the mask slammed back into place, and his smile returned, though it no longer reached his eyes. Marcus's voice was silk over steel. "Daniel Reed, I heard you were dead." He walked slowly toward Daniel, studying him like a collector examining a curiosity. "Turns out you just became a waiter. How fitting." Daniel felt his hands clench into fists at his sides, but he kept his voice level. "Marcus." The single word carried 5 years of grief and rage. Marcus turned to Victoria with an expression of exaggerated concern. "Victoria, I should warn you about this man. He was a director at my company years ago, before we discovered he had been embezzling funds. We had to terminate him, and he suffered some kind of breakdown. Clearly, he's still not well." His voice dripped with false sympathy. "Whatever he's told you, I assure you it's the delusion of a disturbed mind." Victoria's expression gave nothing away. "Mr. Reed has raised some concerns about the structure of our merger, concerns that my team finds credible." Marcus's smile tightened almost imperceptibly. "Credible? You're taking financial advice from a waiter over the most successful investment fund on Wall Street?" He shook his head with theatrical disappointment. "Victoria, I thought you were smarter than this. If you continue to entertain this man's fantasies, I'll have no choice but to reconsider our partnership. The board at Meridian won't accept this kind of instability in a potential partner." The threat hung in the air between them. Victoria said nothing. Marcus gave Daniel one last contemptuous look and walked out, his assistants trailing behind him. Over the next 48 hours, Marcus Webb dismantled Daniel's credibility with surgical precision. He contacted every member of Hale Industries' board of directors, sharing documents that painted Daniel as a mentally unstable criminal. He leaked stories to financial journalists about Victoria's erratic behavior and her reliance on advice from unqualified sources. He orchestrated a campaign of whispers and insinuations that spread through Wall Street like wildfire. By the end of the second day, Victoria's phone was ringing constantly, board members demanding explanations, investors threatening to pull their money, lawyers warning about fiduciary responsibility. Ryan Hale led the internal opposition, arguing loudly that his aunt was risking the company's future on the word of a deranged waiter. Then Marcus found Daniel's weakness. A woman from Child Protective Services arrived at Daniel's apartment on the third day, carrying a clipboard and wearing an expression of bureaucratic concern. She explained that an anonymous complaint had been filed, questioning Daniel's fitness as a parent. Given his history of psychological instability and criminal behavior, the agency was required to conduct a full investigation. Daniel would need to submit to interviews, home inspections, and psychological evaluations. If he failed to cooperate, or if the investigation found evidence of an unsafe environment, temporary custody of Lily would be transferred to the state. Daniel stood in his doorway, watching the woman walk away, and felt the ground crumbling beneath his feet. Victoria called him to her office that evening, She looked exhausted, the strain of the past days visible in the lines around her eyes. The board has given me an ultimatum. Cut ties with you or face a vote of no confidence. She spread her hands in a gesture of helplessness. I believe you, Daniel. Everything you've told me, everything you've shown me. I believe it. But I don't have proof. The documents you analyzed show the flaw, but they don't prove intent. Without evidence of deliberate fraud, it's your word against Marcus Webb's. And Marcus Webb has 40 years of reputation behind him. She leaned forward, her voice urgent. Do you have anything else? Anything at all that could prove what Marcus did to you? Daniel thought of the USB drive hidden in Lily's old teddy bear, the encrypted files he had copied 5 years ago, before everything fell apart. The evidence that could destroy Marcus Webb and prove everything Daniel had said. But using that evidence would mean coming out of hiding completely. It would mean Marcus knowing exactly who he was and where to find him. It would mean putting Lily in danger. Daniel looked at Victoria, and the words came out heavy with defeat. I'm sorry. I can't trade my daughter for this. He stood and walked toward the door. Find another way to stop him. Or don't, but I'm done. He left without looking back. Victoria sat alone in her office, staring at the closed door, knowing that she had just lost the only person who could have saved her empire. Daniel returned to his apartment as the sun was setting. Lily was asleep in her small bedroom, her breathing soft and even. He sat on the edge of her bed and watched her sleep, this small, perfect person who was the only good thing left in his life. A photograph of Sarah sat on the nightstand, his wife smiling at the camera, her eyes full of a future that would never come. Daniel picked up the photo and held it, remembering the last morning he had seen her alive. She had kissed him goodbye and told him to be brave. 2 hours later, she was dead. He had spent 5 years running from that morning, hiding from the man who had taken her from him. And now that same man was about to take everything from another family, another company, another 1,000 innocent people. Lily stirred in her sleep and opened her eyes. Her voice was thick with drowsiness. Daddy, are you okay? Daniel forced a smile and stroked her hair. I'm fine, sweetheart. Go back to sleep. But Lily didn't close her eyes. Instead, she looked at him with an expression that was far too old for her 7 years. I dreamed about Mommy, she whispered. She said you're very brave. She said you always do the right thing, even when it's hard. Daniel felt something break open in his chest. He looked at his daughter, at Sarah's photograph, at the old teddy bear sitting on the shelf across the room. Inside that bear was everything he needed to destroy Marcus Webb. And inside his daughter's eyes was the question he had been avoiding for 5 years. What kind of father did he want to be? He could teach Lily to hide. He could teach her that safety meant silence, that survival meant surrender. Or he could teach her that some things were worth fighting for, even when the cost was everything. Daniel stood slowly and walked to the shelf. He picked up the teddy bear and felt the hard shape of the USB drive hidden inside its stuffing. His hands trembled as he reached for his phone and dialed Victoria's number. When she answered, her voice was weary with defeat. Daniel spoke 3 words that changed everything. I have what you need. Victoria's office became a war room. The night before the scheduled signing ceremony, she gathered the only people she trusted absolutely: her personal attorney, her head of security, and Henderson, the analyst who had recognized Daniel's methodology. Daniel sat at the conference table, the USB drive in front of him, like a loaded weapon. When he finally handed it to Victoria's tech specialist, he felt like he was handing over the last 5 years of his life. The files took 3 hours to decrypt. What they revealed was worse than anyone had imagined. 7 years of fraudulent transactions, shell companies spanning 4 continents, and buried deep in their data, a series of encrypted emails between Marcus Webb and a private investigator, discussing the problem of Sarah Reed and potential solutions. Victoria's face was pale as she finished reading. "We can't just take this to the authorities. Marcus has too many connections. Judges, prosecutors, politicians who owe him favors. If we give him any warning, he'll destroy evidence and disappear." Daniel nodded slowly. He had thought about this for 5 years. "Then we don't give him warning. We let him walk into a trap of his own making." The plan came together over the next several hours. Victoria would proceed with the signing ceremony as scheduled, turning it into a major media event with hundreds of guests, financial journalists, and live coverage. Marcus would be invited to speak about his vision for the merger. And then, in front of everyone who mattered in the financial world, the truth would be revealed. The grand ballroom of Hale Tower had been transformed into a cathedral of wealth and power. Crystal chandeliers cast warm light over 300 guests in designer gowns and tailored suits. Camera crews from every major financial network lined the walls, their equipment humming with anticipation. This was supposed to be the deal of the decade, and everyone wanted to witness history being made. Victoria stood near the stage, greeting guests with a smile that betrayed nothing of what was about to happen. Somewhere in the crowd, Daniel waited in a simple dark suit, invisible among the sea of billionaires and executives. He had spent 5 years perfecting the art of being unseen. Tonight, that skill would serve him one last time. Marcus Webb arrived like a conquering hero. He strode through the crowd, shaking hands, accepting congratulations, radiating the easy confidence of a man who believed he had already won. He caught Victoria's eye across the room and gave her a warm smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. In his mind, Daniel Reed had been neutralized, Victoria had been brought to heel, and $12 billion was about to flow into his accounts through channels so complex that no investigator would ever trace them. He took his place near the stage, surrounded by admirers, and waited for his moment of triumph. When Victoria called him up to speak about the historic partnership, Marcus bounded onto the stage with the energy of a man half his age. The applause was thunderous. Marcus spread his arms wide, embracing the adoration of the crowd. "Ladies and gentlemen, what we're witnessing today is more than a merger. It's a revolution in financial partnership, a new model for cooperation between 2 great institutions." His voice was rich and practiced, every word calibrated for maximum impact. Behind him, a massive screen displayed the Meridian Capital and Hale Industries logos side by side. "I want to thank Victoria Hale for her vision and her trust. Together, we will reshape the financial landscape for generations to come." The crowd applauded again. Marcus smiled his perfect smile. And then the screen behind him changed. The logos disappeared, replaced by columns of numbers and transaction records. Marcus's smile faltered. He turned to look at the screen, and the color drained from his face. The documents were his own. Internal memos, wire transfers, the complete architecture of his fraud laid bare for 300 witnesses and live television cameras. Victoria's voice cut through the murmur of the crowd. "Ladies and gentlemen, what you're seeing is evidence of systematic fraud spanning 7 years. She walked onto the stage, her heels clicking against the hardwood. "Shell companies, fabricated valuations, billions of dollars stolen from investors and partners." She turned to face Marcus directly. "And this man is responsible for all of it." Marcus tried to recover. His voice rose above the growing chaos. "This is a fabrication. Victoria, I don't know what lies you've been fed, but this is clearly the work of a disturbed individual who—" Victoria cut him off with a gesture. "There's someone here who can explain these documents better than I can." She looked toward the crowd and nodded. "Mr. Reed, would you please join us?" The crowd parted as Daniel walked toward the stage. He could feel Marcus's eyes on him, burning with hatred and disbelief. When he climbed the steps and stood facing the man who had destroyed his life, 5 years of grief and rage threatened to overwhelm him, but he kept his voice steady as he began to explain exactly how Marcus Webb had built an empire on fraud and lies. Marcus's composure shattered completely. As Daniel detailed the evidence, as the emails and transaction records scrolled across the screen behind them, Marcus's face contorted with fury. He lunged toward Daniel, his cultured facade crumbling into something feral and desperate. His voice cracked as he screamed across the stage. "You should have died with your wife." The words echoed through the suddenly silent ballroom. 300 witnesses heard Marcus Webb confess to murder in the same breath he denied fraud. Security personnel rushed the stage, but Daniel held up his hand to stop them. He stood face to face with the man who had taken everything from him, and when he spoke, his voice was calm. Daniel looked into Marcus's eyes without hatred, without fear. "You took my career. You took my wife. You tried to take my daughter." He shook his head slowly. "But there's one thing you could never take from me: the truth." Marcus lunged again, but this time security was ready. They wrestled him to the ground as police officers who had been waiting in the wings rushed onto the stage. The crowd watched in stunned silence as Marcus Webb, the genius of Wall Street, was handcuffed and led away. His screams of denial echoed through the ballroom long after he disappeared through the service entrance. The aftermath unfolded over the following weeks. Marcus Webb was charged with fraud, market manipulation, and conspiracy in connection with Sarah Reed's death. The investigation that had been closed 5 years ago was reopened, and new evidence emerged linking Marcus to the sabotage of Sarah's car. The merger was canceled. Hale Industries emerged stronger than ever, its reputation enhanced by Victoria's role in exposing the fraud. Daniel was publicly vindicated, his name cleared of all accusations. Ryan Hale sought him out personally, his earlier arrogance replaced by genuine shame. He apologized without excuses and thanked Daniel for saving his aunt's company. Daniel accepted the apology with a handshake. People could change. He had to believe that. Victoria called Daniel to her office 1 week after Marcus's arrest. She sat behind her desk, looking more relaxed than he had ever seen her. "I have a job offer for you. Chief Strategy Officer of Hale Industries. 8-figure salary. Every privilege you could imagine." Daniel smiled, but shook his head before she finished speaking. 5 years ago, I had all of that. It didn't protect my family." He stood and walked to the window, looking out at the city that had once been his kingdom. "I don't need power, Mrs. Hale. I just need to be my daughter's father without living in fear." Victoria studied him for a long moment, then nodded with something like respect. "You taught me something, Daniel. I spent my whole life judging people by their status. You showed me that was my biggest mistake." 2 weeks later, Daniel walked Lily to school on a crisp autumn morning. She skipped ahead of him, her backpack bouncing, then turned at the gate to wave goodbye. Daniel waved back and watched her disappear through the doors. For the first time in 5 years, he didn't scan the street for threats. He didn't look over his shoulder for shadows from his past. His phone buzzed with a text from Victoria. "If you ever change your mind, the door is always open. Not because you're a genius, but because you're a man of integrity." Daniel smiled and slipped the phone back into his pocket. He walked down the ordinary street, surrounded by ordinary people rushing to ordinary jobs. He was not a ghost anymore. He was not a victim. He was just a father, living his life in the light, true to the promise he had made to Sarah and to the little girl who believed her daddy would always do the right thing. The city swallowed him into its rhythm, and Daniel Reed finally disappeared, not into hiding, but into the simple, honest life he had earned.